It's great.
Ta-da! It's blue.
Here's the thing about elevator music.
Time for some more painting. This is the trim color. The first victims are these pieces. I was going to use PVC trim, but it's just a little bit too bulbous. Don't think it quite fits the aesthetic. Cool. Here's another example of where I'm borrowing a finish, something I mentioned in the last episode. Oh, this one's a little bit more straightforward. I got this steel weldable 3/4 inch tube and a pretty inexpensive tube bender on Amazon. And using these, I'm able to create pieces that can look like bare metal, but actually really nice and custom, something that's going to add a lot to the ship. Since we have these PVC elements that are painted, if those are just in there by themselves, I think they're going to call attention as being what they are. And I've got these little 3D printed parts. These will be going on either end of these steel bent tubes, and those are the pull handles for the door panel at the back of the bay. Got some of this black rubber, very flexible U-channel trim, which I'll run around the outside of the bay door and its enclosing shape. And then I used some 2x2s, split lengthwise down the middle at 45 degrees, painted that trim color, and centered with some more plastic vinyl trim to create the lower edges and hide the seams of the floor grating, as well as installing the metal trim I had previously painted around outer corners of the rest of the bay. While working on other stuff, I have spent the last few weeks 3D printing on the Artisan a comical number of parts. I don't know why I did that. Now I have to pick those up. Anyway, these parts were all designed in plasticity, and they're going to be used for a variety of the hero elements around different parts of the ship, to add a unified aesthetic and also make the found garbage feel a little bit more like an actual space. So I put together one of the door piston assemblies to make sure it all works properly before we start to think about painting. For the actual piston slides, I've got a couple of pieces of reasonably snugly fit nested pipe here. Those will just get adhered together. For the interior of the piston slides, I'm actually using metal, one that fits basically perfectly inside of this PVC sleeve. And here's a decent side-by-side comparison. To give it the look of a piston that has slid in and out of its tube over and over again, I ran it through some sandpaper so that it would have those anisotropic reflections. Now, for the bases of these assemblies, everything is printed out of PLA, which is not overwhelmingly structurally strong. So I'm actually going to be running really long screws through the plastic, so the shear forces are actually supported by metal rather than layer adhesion. And then I 3D printed a number of fake hex caps to put over the screw ends so that it looks more industrial. Here's one example of a moving piece with the rotational axis supported by a series of screws to give it strength. Here I'm once again using the Rust-Oleum filler primer diluted with specialty reducer and sprayed using my HVLP gun to start to coat the parts. This serves two purposes this time. One is to help hide the layer lines, yes. However, one thing I really want to accomplish with these pieces is to give them the feel of a piece of very old farm or naval equipment. There's this particular feeling that really thickly layered old paint has that I think will help bring home the sensation of these heavy industrial parts. So each component wound up getting 3 pretty heavy coats of filler primer with some dry time and then a sanding pass between. Here's a decent side-by-side of one of the pieces immediately after the first coat and with its sanding. And here's the final thickness of filler primer on a couple parts. Now you can still see some layer lines here, but we're actually going to hide that with a nice no sanding trick when we get to painting. We've got ourselves some parts. Let's get these things assembled. Although I've tested all of the individual components already, this is my first time putting it all together in the location where it's actually going to live. That's the pistons done. Week or so of my life sunk into these, and I actually haven't fully tested the mechanism yet. You're going to join me for the ride as we open this thing for the first time and see what happens. Okay, it actually wasn't that bad. What happened is I made the tolerances too tight and created a vacuum. So I drilled some holes to release the pressure and we were good to go. Phew, phew, phew. Now that is satisfying. To add in additional real metal finish as a grounding element, and to create more interesting visual texture and some compositional shape elements for the piston housings, and I did this in some other parts around the bay as well, I got some refrigerator tubing, a tube straightener, and then a small handheld bender so I could create wire cages. Here's an example from the second episode of the show where Ian used that technique in his visual effects work for the coffee machine on the Phaeton. The process is super straightforward. I just run the cut length that I need for the straightener, and then I bend it to the dimensions that I need to fit the piece. The ends of the metal go into little 3D printed brackets, which I attach to the bases using screws and glue. The 3D printed and painted panel element went onto the hatch door to give it a little bit more dimension and interest. However, this spot is too empty. Fortunately, I have collected rather a significant amount of very nice garbage for just such an eventuality. Let's make a big ol' floodlight that lives in the corner, swivels out, and shines a very bright beam out the door anytime the panel's open. It'll fill that space, add a lot of great visual detail, and it's nice to have functional moving elements so that the space feels very practical. Well, maybe practicality is not the primary goal here, but you get the idea. This is the inside of an old dehumidifier that I ripped apart when it reached the end of its lifespan. This fan's got a little, what I think is still a working motor on the inside of it, so I'm going to see if I can't rig power up to that so that this will spin when the device is in operation. I want to give the impression that when this thing's running, even though it'll realistically just be a big LED or something like that, that it's generating a ton of heat and that it actually needs this element to keep it cool. Wound up using a grow light for the bulb, the back part of an old plunge router for part of the bulb housing, a reclaimed section of exercise equipment that I found on the side of the road for a big sturdy swivel, and a couple of heavy-duty drawer slides for the ceiling mount so that the entire unit can move laterally from its position. While getting it mounted in the corner where it lives, I also ran some power through the ceiling there so that I could test out the light bulb. With the mount solution tested, I took the whole thing back down again so that I could kit bash a whole bunch more elements on and make it feel like a complete piece rather than just the inside of a dehumidifier. I got the whole thing painted outside, and then I brought it back in to remount, run final power, and, using similar techniques from before, create some solid metal pieces for handles and cage details. To match the voltage and amperage requirements of the DC motor I wound up swapping the fan onto, I actually wound up using an LED power source since it was the only appropriate one I had around the workshop. But it adds a nice visual element since it's a bright metal. Since the new DC motor was a different size, I designed and 3D printed some custom brackets for it. The parts actually touching the motor are made out of resin, so they can withstand the heat when it's running. The motor isn't particularly loud, but it does have a hum when running, so I put it on a separate switch from the light bulb. That way, anytime we don't need it on in the scene, it won't interfere with the sound. At this point, I decided that the drywall corner bead I used for the trim looked too much like drywall corner bead, so I replaced it with some 90-degree solid aluminum trim I had gotten, once again, at my favorite hardware store. The ladder is made out of a mix of found and made components. The side rails for the ladder are actually parts of a bed frame that I got at Goodwill. I originally designed in plasticity a lot more parts to be created using a mix of 3D printing and CNC milling from MDF and plywood. Unfortunately, the pieces for the rungs were too large for the CNC mill I have on hand. Someday, so help me, I will have a large format CNC table. But our little independent show budget is not particularly suited to outsourcing pieces that don't absolutely need it. And so I wound up making the rungs myself out of some lumber, which I later put aluminum grip treads on. I did wind up using the 3D printed standoffs I designed, which help prevent the ladder from bowing in and out when anybody climbs on it. We need this thing to be seriously sturdy, since it's going to get a fair amount of heavy use. With the ladder location locked in, I moved on to preparing the rails. I need to have holes that come through the sides, since the rungs themselves are going to be supported significantly with screws and bolts that come in laterally. I used the press to drill rows of holes, 2 side by side, on each side of each rung. For the standoffs that I 3D printed, I don't particularly have to worry about whether the layer adhesion is good enough to help support a human body. All of these are only going to be under compression. I have very long deck screws that will be running all the way through them and into the solid wood backer behind. Basically, for this whole project, in any case where I need something to have structural integrity, I'm not relying on the 3D print, and I'm borrowing the strength of the metal instead. After getting the rungs attached, I put the ladder up in its final location and used the aforementioned screws to get it secured, and then it was time to test it. Oh, thank goodness. The curved upper handles at the top of the ladder are made out of a piece of solid steel exercise equipment that I salvaged. And to hide the screws, I used my trusty 3D printed fake rivets. Let's go ahead and up-detail this module, add a shutter window where this awful cardboard is, and install these curved wraparound I-beam pieces that I 3D printed. I got them installed where they needed to go with a mix of hot glue followed by screws that went into the wood above, and then I needed to fill the seams in a way that wouldn't split over time, for which I used Elastopatch, a nice flexible crack sealer. This is where the kitchenette will be. Leading through here to the bay area, we're actually going to have a sliding shutter window. Eventually, I'm going to need to build in this rolled upper shape so that the upper slide can go into that channel and the lower slide will go down into this well. I'm not actually going to make this part functional yet because it'll be an engineering challenge and take a fair amount of time. For the time being, all I actually need is the facade on the far side so that when we're shooting into the bay, so long as the window is in its closed position, it'll look like a piece that could be moved. When you're cutting a hole out of the center of a piece of stock, there's a few good tools that you have at your disposal. For hand tools, one of the most common tools you're going to use is what's known as a... But frankly, it's really hard to get clean lines with a jigsaw, so something I personally like to do is to line up my circ saw and just drop it through carefully, perfectly aligned with the straight edges. I run that to where I can, and I use the jigsaw just for these. To help mitigate the indie film pitfall of a set that just looks like painted plywood, I'm using joint compound skimmed slightly incorrectly to help hide the texture of the wood and to give it the beginnings of a pitted metal finish. This'll really sell later after it's been painted. Eventually, I'm going to want the shutter doors to be articulated, the way a garage door is, with independent panels. But for the time being, again, we only need the aesthetic. I did a series of shallow 45-degree cuts going either direction to create the illusion of these shutter panels. Then I was prepared to get the pieces mounted. For the time being, both panels are simply screwed in place in the closed shutter position, and I used some good old-fashioned brushed steel drawer pulls for the handles. This vinyl edge trim is a temporary solution. Once the doors move, I think I'm going to want to replace it with brush trim. Now, we don't actually need to see up into the cockpit at any point during these incoming bay shoots, but this whole area will be a problem if it's just open like this. So I created a little frame and used a piece of bent hardboard to create the tunnel leading up above. The only other thing required to create visual separation is to close off that threshold, for which I used a retractable canopy. Then I went through and up-detailed the module below the shutter window, which is going to be a sort of ventilation system. I also added a working fire extinguisher. With that, all the core elements necessary for this area are basically complete, and I can move on to the next big step. Today is the day! What day, you might be wondering? Well, that little juicy nugget of information is a secret. The flyaway wall is built out of a few separate panels, each of which basically function as a flat and is held in place by a few screws. They can be removed individually if necessary, although the process is a little bit involved since they'll be pretty heavily detailed on the inside. After I've had a chance to do some camera tests with Ian, I am expecting to add a handful of access hatches of a sort for the camera to poke through when we want to be filming with the flyaway wall in place. And I can hide those with other little modules or details, but for the time being it just gets paneled with hardboard and painted the same way as the rest of the ship. I want to have tiny light accents throughout the ship, so I created some of these modules to hold LEDs and some OLED screens. Each of these details is just a tiny Arduino build, and after getting my components soldered, I designed some little GUIs for different parts of the bay to go into the modules, using A-Sprite. I then exported each animation as a bitmap sequence, which was converted to a series of byte arrays to tell the Arduino what to display when on each OLED. Now we'll have some nice, subtle little looping visuals on each Arduino so long as it is powered. Each module had its corresponding screen installed, along with a series of colored LEDs, and there you go. Probably nobody will ever see them up close, but each screen has information relevant to its location and function in the ship. So, for instance, the winch controls here have graphics that represent the winch, and the display on the ventilation and humidity control system tells us that the filter has needed replacing for eons, which motivates why the ship is so humid and water damaged in its final finish. I'm skipping back to the piston mechanisms for a minute here. Since the whole situation is made out of different types of plastic and PVC pipe, it's got a little bit of sag, which I don't think looks very good and increases friction when I'm trying to open or close the door. So I made these little rubber band powered supports, which help to keep the pistons level, both in the closed and open positions. To give the loading door of the bay a little bit more of a cargo aircraft vibe, I modeled up a panel to overlay it in plasticity. And my friend McKinley over at Kitbash Studios used their large format CNC to carve it out. It still needs the insert details, as well as beveled edges, so I went ahead and slapped on a mask, and then got to beveling.
Elevator music.
I 3D printed the details I needed for the inserts, and those got laid in with a bit of wood glue and a mallet. They're a pretty snug fit, and they dried nice and sturdy. I used a process similar to the one I did for the vertical hull ribs in the other episodes to create these horizontal ribs to help give the space a little bit more detail and make it not feel quite so flat. After the initial paint pass, I go back through and use a tinted polyurethane wood stain to clear coat to protect, as well as to take down the brilliance of the blue and some of its saturation so it looks less cartoonish. Before getting started on the final materials and weathering, I went through and did another pass of adding various details to give the space more texture, as well as a couple of functional elements, and I went and installed the panel, now painted, for the bay door. From the giant collection of 2 years' worth of collected cables and tubes, I ran stuff all around the ship to make it look like things were connected. I used the plunge router to create some channels through the bay door where I wanted to install recessed can lighting, soldered a series of different LED strips, which can be color changed later, to go into the wells, cut some recessed channels into the foam on the back of the door to run the wires through, and used some stained and colored textured light diffuser plastic on the top. At this point I decided that the amount of yellow was a little bit too much, so I repainted a number of those elements in the same khaki brown as the bay door panel. You'll have to wait for the relevant episode to find out what the ship's official friendly name is, but I did give it a factory model designation. In my mind, in universe, these ships are sometimes referred to as goldfinches. See if you can figure out why. And now it's officially time for the make or break part of the build. Finishing, weathering, materials. I wound up doing a fair amount of R&D on this project, and on my Patreon I'll be covering all of the processes I wound up developing to make this finish happen. The reference material for this was a mix of salt-encrusted old naval metal and Soviet-era trains that have aged for a very long time. I want to give the impression that this is a very old, very used piece of machinery. It's built like a tank, and it's still kicking, and it would honestly be pretty hard to destroy. But it also hasn't been kept in crazy good repair. The mechanical components of the ship are all still working just fine, and that's all our pilot really cares about, at least for this room. This ship has been used for everything under the sun, multiple suns probably, and when that bay door gets open, who's to say what the atmosphere outside will do to a finish that isn't carefully polished and maintained. If you've watched much of the rest of the show, you'll notice that there's also a fair amount of this maximum entropy finish approach in a number of the visual effects as well. Personally, I love that it gives the universe a feeling of weight and age. Shiny science fiction is great too, but there's something about the grime that you just experience in your daily life, at least in my opinion, that can really help ground you in what it feels like to be inside of a space. And I want this to feel tangible. So, here's how it turned out.